The last message sent from Earth before the battle was not an order. It was a sound. Someone in the communications room of Fleet Command had pressed play on an old recording, a choir, human voices, no instruments, and broadcast it on every channel the fleet could reach. Nobody ordered it. Nobody stopped it. The ships moved into formation while that sound traveled outward into the dark. Admiral Reyes heard it on the bridge of the carrier Resolute and said nothing. She watched her crew. Some of them closed their eyes. None of them looked afraid. That was the thing about humans that the Vakthari never understood and never tried to. Fear was not the same as defeat. The two had almost nothing to do with each other. The Vakthari came in a wedge. 43 warships, sleek and dark, built for speed and surgical destruction. Their hulls were layered in a reactive alloy that could absorb pulse fire and return it as heat scatter. Their guns fired in geometric patterns designed to collapse defensive formations in under 4 minutes. In 400 years of expansion, the Vakthari had never needed more than one wave to end a war. Warspeaker Drath watched the human fleet on the display grid and felt the first small thread of something he did not name. The humans were not spreading out. They were tightening, pulling inward. Their formation looked, to his trained eye, like something bracing for impact rather than preparing to fight. The first salvo was Vakthari. It struck the outer edge of the human line and deleted 6 frigates in 9 seconds. Clean, fast, textbook. Drath waited for the formation to break. It did not break. Captain Doran, aboard the destroyer Whetstone, watched the 6 ships die on his tactical screen and felt his jaw tighten. He had trained with 2 of those crews. He did not say anything about that. He said, "Adjust bearing 14 degrees, put us between the wreckage and the second column, and tell engineering if they give me less than 80% output in the next 3 minutes, I will personally go down there and push." The wreckage was the key. Reyes had seen it in the simulation models. Vakthari guns were precise, but precision required clean sight lines. Human debris was irregular, unpredictable. The destroyed ships became a wall of metal and venting gas that scattered the targeting geometry the Vakthari relied on. It was not a strategy anyone had invented. It was something Reyes had noticed 3 weeks before the battle while watching her nephew play with building blocks. When the blocks fell, they fell in ways that made the next structure harder to build cleanly. She had stared at that pile of fallen blocks for a long time. The Vakthari fired a second salvo. 3 more human ships were destroyed. But the return fire from the human formation, using the debris as cover, damaged 2 Vakthari cruisers and knocked one entirely off its flight path. Drath adjusted. He was good. His fleet was good. They shifted angle and came in from above the ecliptic plane where the debris field offered no cover. It was a clean tactical read. It should have worked. What he had not modeled was this. Humans had anticipated the adjustment, not because they had read Vakthari doctrine, though they had, but because Reyes had spent 3 days in a room with her best tactical minds asking one question over and over. If you were them watching us and we did this, what would you do next? They had mapped it. Every likely response, every clean move, and for each one a prepared answer. The Vakthari came in from above the ecliptic and found a line of automated weapons platforms that had been sitting cold and silent in the asteroid belt for 6 months. They powered on. They fired. It was not enough to win. It was enough to hurt. Drath pulled back. For the first time in his career, he pulled back from an engagement with a single-world species. He needed to think. His ships regrouped at the edge of the gravity well, and he sat in the silence of his command room and wrote a report to Oru at high command. The report was 3 pages. The last line said, "They do not fight to survive the battle. They fight as if they have already decided they will survive the war. This is a meaningful difference. I am not certain our models account for it." He sent it. He stared at the display grid. The human fleet had not pursued. It had reformed tighter than before and gone quiet. No communications, no signals, just presence, just the fact of them sitting there in the dark, not leaving. On the Resolute, Reyes ate a cold meal at her console and read the damage reports. 41 crew dead, 9 ships destroyed or mission-critical damaged. She marked each name in the log herself. She always did. It took an hour. Then she did something that no one on her staff understood. She opened a broadcast channel, open frequency, no encryption, and transmitted a single audio file into the dark toward the Vakthari fleet. 30 seconds of silence, and then that choir again. The same recording someone had played before the battle. Drath received it. He listened to the whole thing. He played it again. He asked his translator what it was. The translator said it was music. Drath asked what it meant. The translator said that was not a question translation could answer. Drath sat with that for a long time. Far out from either fleet, in a direction that pointed toward nothing on any Vakthari star chart, something moved. Something very large. It left no signature that either side's sensors were designed to detect. But it moved. And it had been moving for a long time, coming from a very great distance. It was almost here. The Vakthari did not sleep the way humans did. They entered a low-rest state, aware but slowed, and during that time their minds processed the day's data without the noise of active thought. Drath spent 6 hours in that state after the first engagement and came out of it with a single clear thought. The humans had not tried to win. They had tried to last. That was a different kind of war. He had never fought that kind. Oru at high command dismissed the concern. He sent a second wave with a brief message. 41 ships, end it. There was no tactical briefing, no new approach, just more force applied to the same problem, because in the Vakthari model of warfare, more force applied correctly always resolved the equation. Drath accepted the order. He did not argue. He positioned the second wave in a 3-axis approach designed to eliminate the debris field tactic from the first battle. Clean angles, overwhelming numbers. He ran the models. On paper, the human fleet had no answer. On paper, the humans had spent the 6 days between engagements doing something the Vakthari surveillance drones recorded but did not flag as significant. They had been moving rocks, not ships. Rocks. Small asteroids, ice chunks, dead ore from the belt, moving them slowly with tugs and tether cables into rough positions along their defensive perimeter. The second Vakthari wave came in fast and clean from 3 angles and immediately began taking impacts from debris that was not in any map because it had not been there 6 days ago. Not weapons, just mass, just things in the way. Chunks of ice and iron that fouled targeting arrays, cracked heat shield panels, forced evasive burns that broke formation geometry. It was not elegant. Humans did not always need elegant. Doran's ship, the Whetstone, had been patched overnight and was running at 60%. He had been offered a rear position. He had declined. He pulled his ship into the thickest part of the fight and used it the way a boxer uses a shoulder, absorbing, crowding, giving his smaller ships room to operate on the flanks. He lost 2 more crew in the second hour, a conduit breach in the lower decks. He sent a medic and kept moving. There was nothing else to do. You could stop and grieve, or you could keep the ship in the fight. You could not do both. That was the part of command that nobody explained to you before you took the seat. The second wave stalled at the Mars corridor. Not a defeat, not a retreat, just a stall. 41 Vakthari ships holding a line they could not advance past against a human fleet that was smaller, slower, and less powerful, and yet would not move. Drath watched it on the display. He made the call to hold position and sent another report to Oru. This one was shorter. It said, "Request strategic pause. Our models require updating. The human force multiplier is not firepower or technology. It is behavior. We do not have a category for this." Oru's response came in 4 words. There is no pause. Drath read that 4 times. Then he set it aside and looked at the sensor data again, because something else had been bothering him since the first engagement, and he had not had time to properly examine it. The anomaly was small. A gravitational whisper at the edge of the long-range array. Not a ship, not a natural body, something that was moving with intent but producing almost no detectable signature. The Vakthari sensors were the finest in known space. They could detect a cold engine at 12 light minutes. Whatever this was had been nearly invisible to them, and that should have been impossible. He tagged it, sent it to his science officer, asked for a profile. The science officer came back in 2 hours with a response that he read 3 times before accepting it as real. The mass displacement reading suggested an object approximately 80 kilometers in length. The drive signature was not ion, not pulse, not any known form of propulsion. The scientist had spent an hour checking the instruments for error before concluding that they were not wrong. Drath sat very still. On the Resolute, Dr. Voss had been awake for 30 hours. She was the fleet's lead xenobiologist, which under normal circumstances meant she studied samples and wrote reports that admirals never read. Under current circumstances, she had become the person everyone asked questions to, and nobody had better answers than. She had been tracking the anomaly for 11 hours before the Vakthari sensors found it. Human instruments were less precise but broader sweep. She had seen the displacement signature and done the same calculations and arrived at the same number. 80 kilometers, give or take. She brought her tablet to Ray's at hour 31 and set it on the console without a word. Ray's looked at it, looked at Voss, said, "Is this confirmed?" Voss said, "I have run it 6 times." Ray said, "What is it?" Voss said, "I don't know. I know what it is not. It is not Vakthari. It is not any registered or catalogued vessel type, and it is coming from a direction that does not correspond to any known inhabited system." Ray's looked at the trajectory line on the display, followed it with her eye. It led directly to the space between the 2 fleets. She called a war council for the following morning, but she did not sleep. She stood at the viewport for the rest of the night and looked out at the stars and tried to remember that Big Dark was normal, that it had always been there, that whatever was moving through it had also always been there, long before any of this. It did not help as much as she hoped. It did not arrive the way things arrived in stories. There was no dramatic flash, no shockwave. One moment the sector of space between the 2 fleets was empty, and the next it was not. The object simply existed there, the way a mountain exists, fully, completely, as if it had always been there and the universe had simply waited for you to notice it. 81 kilometers long. The sensors revised the estimate upward 3 times in the first hour. It was dark, nearly light-absorbing, but not perfectly so. The surface had a faint geometric texture visible only when light struck it at specific angles. From most angles, it looked like a hole in space, a place where stars were missing. Both fleets stopped firing. This was not a decision. There were no orders issued on either side to cease engagement. The crews on both sides simply stopped, because the human brain and whatever passed for its equivalent in the Vakthari simply could not hold the fight in this at the same time. There was not enough room. Drath stood at the display and felt something he had no word for. The Vakthari were not a species that frightened easily. They had conquered 40 systems. They had faced things that would break most minds and processed them as tactical problems. But the old records, the records kept not in the military archive but in the temple archive, the stories told by the priest caste that the warrior caste dismissed as ceremony, those records had a name for what he was looking at. Pale Architect. He had heard it once as a child. An elder had used it to explain why certain sectors of space were mapped but never settled. The architects had made those places, the elder said. They were old beyond counting. They had moved on. Nobody explained where. Nobody explained why some places still felt like they were waiting for them to return. Drath pulled that memory up and set it next to what he was seeing on the display and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just run out of comfortable explanations, that the elder had not been speaking mythology. He sent a signal to Oru at high command. He included the sensor data. He included the temple archive reference. He included no recommendation because he had none. Oru's response took 40 minutes. When it came, it was 2 sentences. Hold position. Do not engage. Drath thought, yes, that was already obvious. On the Resolute, Voss was the first person to notice that the surface of the object was not simply textured. She had been running spectral analysis for 20 minutes and the returns were strange. The geometric patterns on the hull were not purely structural. They had internal variation, regularity within regularity, a pattern that repeated but changed with each repetition in ways that were not random. She had seen this kind of thing before, in data, in genetic code, in written language. She told Reyes. Reyes stared at the display for a long moment and then said, quietly, "How long to translate it?" Voss said she did not know. She said she needed to begin without knowing the end. Reyes told her to begin. Then Reyes did the thing that her staff would later say they could not believe and also could not imagine anyone else doing. She opened a channel to the Vakthari fleet. Not encrypted, not coded. Plain open broadcast on a frequency both sides had been using for targeting coordination before everything stopped. She said, "This is Admiral Reyes' Earth Combined Fleet. I am speaking to whoever commands the Vakthari force. I have one question. Did you know this was coming?" Silence. Drath's communications officer looked at him. Drath looked at the display. He thought about Oru's standing orders, which did not cover this scenario because no scenario brief had ever imagined it. He thought about the object outside, sitting between two fleets like a judge who had not yet spoken. He pressed transmit. "No," he said, one word. Then he added because it seemed important to be precise, "We have legends, we did not believe them." Reyes heard that and felt the weight of it. Legends meant history. History meant this had happened before. She looked at Voss, who was bent over her console running algorithms, and thought, "How much time do we have?" She asked. Voss said she did not know yet. The surface text was dense and the language had no known relative. She was working from pure structural analysis, the shape of the patterns, the frequency of repetition, the way certain symbols clustered near others. It was like reading a language by only looking at the spaces between words. 3 hours into the silence, the object transmitted. It was not a directed signal. It went everywhere in all directions at all frequencies simultaneously. Both fleets received it at the same moment. It lasted 12 seconds and then stopped. Voss recorded it. She ran it through every analytical tool she had. She isolated 3 words, or what she believed were 3 words, 3 distinct recurring clusters, and translated them with about 60% confidence. She brought the tablet to Reyes. Reyes read it. She read it again. She set the tablet face down on the console, which was something Voss had never seen her do. Reyes picked it back up. She opened the channel to the Vakthari fleet again. She said, "Drath, I need to share something with you. It is not good." Drath said, "I assumed." Reyes read him the 3 words. "Judgment Harvest begin." The channel stayed open. Neither side said anything. Outside, the object had not moved. It did not need to. It had the patience of something that had been waiting long enough that a few more hours meant nothing at all. Nobody declared the ceasefire. It just became true. The guns on both sides went cold and stayed cold, and neither fleet moved toward the other. They moved instead toward the facts, which were piling up faster than anyone could organize them. Voss worked for 19 straight hours. She ate when someone put food next to her hand. She slept for 40 minutes face down on her console and woke up mid-thought and kept going. The text on the hull was the longest document she had ever encountered. She was not reading it so much as feeling her way through it, finding anchor points, working outward from each one. What she built, piece by piece, was a picture that kept getting worse the clearer it became. The pale architects had not died. They had made a choice. A civilization that old her best estimate from the complexity and age of the language was that the hull text predated all known spacefaring species by at least 500 million years. A civilization that old does not end by accident. It ends by decision. They had withdrawn from the physical dimensions that everything else used into something Voss had no framework for. But before they left, they built a system. The system worked like this. A seeding species was selected, given a push. Given the right biological structures to become expansionist and aggressive, the Vakthari, they were not natural, they were built for a purpose. Their aggression, their drive to conquer and eliminate had not evolved, it had been installed. The Vakthari were a test. Whatever species survived contact with them long enough and in the right way was deemed worthy of the next stage. The architects would return. They would assess. They would harvest. Harvest meant absorption, not death, not slavery. The architects took the successful species into whatever they had become in whatever space they now occupied. The records on the hull included partial accounts from previous cycles. There had been others, not many. 3 that she could confirm in the text, all in the last 100 million years, all of which ended the same way. The test species survived. The architects returned. Both the seeding species and the survivor were taken. The Vakthari were taken too, every time. They were tools. They had never been told. Voss called Rays and then they called Drath together on an open channel, and Voss spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. She said at the end, "I could be wrong about details. I am not wrong about the structure." Drath was silent for a long time. Then he said, "How long have the architects been running this?" Voss said, "The oldest cycle referenced in the text that I can date with confidence is roughly 400 million years ago." Drath said nothing. Voss let the silence sit. She understood it. She had needed 20 minutes of her own silence when the number had first come clear. Rays said, "Can it be stopped?" Voss said, "The text is the operating code. It is written on the outside because they never imagined anything would get close enough to read it. I have been looking for a weakness in the code for the last 6 hours. There is something. It may not be a weakness. It may be a test inside the test." She explained the override. The hull text contained a failsafe, an interrupt. Not hidden, it was right there in the architecture, but you had to understand the whole document well enough to recognize it. The override was not activated by a key or a signal. It was activated by an answer. A question was encoded into the interrupt sequence, and the hull required physical input, someone tracing the answer directly onto the surface to register it. The question was this: what do you choose when given the choice between your survival and the survival of your enemy? Drath said, "What have previous species answered?" Voss said, "The records only show outcomes, every previous cycle completed, which means no species that faced this question has ever activated the interrupt." Rays said, "Because they chose themselves." Voss said, "Yes." The channel was quiet. Outside, the mothership had begun to move, slowly, with the geometric precision of something that had performed this same motion many times across an incomprehensible span of history. It was not attacking, it was positioning, moving to a point equidistant from both fleets where its harvest systems would have clean reach in all directions. Rays called a combined tactical session with Drath. They pooled sensor data, drive signatures, weapons arrays. They ran a joint strike simulation. The results were the same every time. The hull was not penetrable with anything either fleet carried. The energy simply went in and did not come back out. Drath said, "So we cannot fight it." Rays said, "We can answer it." Drath said, "The answer is obvious. The question is whether the obvious answer works." Rays said, "Voss." Voss said, "I believe it does. The interrupt is a genuine failsafe. I think the architects built it because some part of them hoped. I think they left the door open on purpose." Drath said, "That is a large amount of trust to place in the psychology of something 500 million years dead." Rays said, "You have a better option." He did not. She looked at Doran across the bridge. He had been listening the whole time. He met her eyes and she did not say anything, and he nodded once. He said, "Who do I take with me and what do I need to write?" Voss pulled up the interrupt sequence on her display. She began explaining. The chamber was very quiet. The mothership moved through the dark outside, patient, enormous, ancient, not yet aware that something small and stubborn was already planning to climb onto its face. The 6 of them left the whetstone in a modified cargo pod with the engines cut. drifting on a calculated ballistic path that would bring them to the mothership's hull in 40 minutes. No active propulsion. No powered systems except suit life support and the tight beam receiver in Doran's helmet, which connected him to Voss on the Resolute. Cold and dark and silent, sliding through space towards something that could have crushed them the way a boot crushes a grain of sand, if it had ever bothered to notice them. Doran spent the 40 minutes going over the sequence. Voss had built him a physical guide, a sheet of pressure-sensitive material with the interrupt pattern drawn on it, which he could use as a tracing template. The sequence was 214 distinct symbols arranged in a flowing connected path roughly 3 meters long. He had practiced it 4 times on the whetstone floor. He had it. Mostly. The 31st symbol was the one that kept slipping. He practiced it again in his head during the drift. Eyes closed. The symbol like a river branching at a delta, 3 lines diverging from a central curve. The pod made contact with the hull without sound. They had magnetic anchors. Doran went out first. His boots locked to the surface, and he stood on the face of the most ancient artifact in the known universe and looked at the text running beneath his feet and felt something that was not quite fear and was not quite wonder but lived between them. The hull was warm, not hot, warm like a living thing at rest. The geometric text covered every visible centimeter, layered and precise, glowing very faintly at the edges where the pattern lines met. In the suit, it felt like standing on something that breathed too slowly for you to feel it breathing, but you knew it was. Voss was in his ear immediately. "I have your position on the relay. You are 40 meters from the interrupt node. Move along the hull on bearing 273. Doran moved. The team spread out in a loose line behind him. They moved in silence, magnetic boots clicking softly, the mothership enormous below them and the stars enormous above, and the 2 fleets visible as distant clusters of light on either side, watching. Drath was watching from his command ship. He had not slept. He had spent the waiting time reading the temple archive records that his culture had preserved for 2,000 years without understanding what they preserved. He found references to a great vessel, a vessel that had come before the Dominion, a vessel that had been seen once and then gone and never returned. The record said, "It will return when the harvest is due." He had believed until 3 days ago that this was poetry. He watched the 6 small human shapes moving across the hull on his long-range visual feed and thought about what Voss had said, that the architects had built the interrupt because they hoped. He thought about what it meant to build a civilization-ending harvesting machine and then put a door in it because some part of you hoped someone would find it and choose differently. He thought that was either the saddest thing he had ever learned or the most important. He was not sure there was a difference. At the 20-minute mark, the mothership moved. Not toward the fleet. Not outward. The hull beneath Doran's team shifted, a slow, enormous tectonic adjustment in the surface geometry, the text pattern reconfiguring across a wide area. 2 of the team were anchored in the reconfiguring zone. Their magnetic boots lost contact. Field inversion, as the hull polarity reversed in a wave rolling outward from the repositioning zone. 2 people lost to the dark. Doran watched it happen and could not do anything and did not stop moving. He had known when he left the pod that this was the kind of mission where you kept going or you did not go. He kept going. Voss recalculated the path. Her voice was steady. She had been steady for 3 days, and Doran thought about that later, what it cost a person to be steady for that long, what they were burning through to keep it. 14 minutes to the node. He arrived at the interrupt site and looked down at it. The pattern was exactly as Voss had described it. The symbols were larger here, each one the size of a human chest, arranged in a spiral path that converged on a central symbol that was different from all the others. It had depth. The others were surface patterns. This one went down into the hull as if the hull had been folded around it. Doran removed the tracing template from his suit pocket. He pressed it to the first symbol and traced it. The hull responded, not violently, a warmth localized spreading from where his hand moved. The glow at the symbol edges brightened slightly. He moved to the second symbol. then the third. Voss counted with him, quietly, just the numbers one after another, steady as breathing. At symbol 31, the branching delta, the one that had slipped, he stopped. He could feel his hand wanting to move wrong. He closed his eyes inside the helmet. He saw it in his memory. River branching. Central curve first. 3 lines out. He opened his eyes and drew it correctly. The hull went very still. The ambient warmth dropped away. All the glow in the surrounding text dimmed to nothing. Then he was at the last symbol. The central one, the deep one. He laid his whole palm flat on it. He said out loud, not to anyone, both. The mothership went dark. The silence after the mothership went dark lasted 47 seconds. Voss counted them. She was counting because it was better than waiting. At second 47, the hull beneath Doran's feet trembled once, gently, like a sleeping animal shifting, and then the surface text began to move. Not the way it had moved before. This was the symbols themselves rearranging, flowing into new configurations with the smooth certainty of a sentence being rewritten. Doran watched it happen around his boots and did not move. He stayed. He sent a visual feed back to Voss, and she watched it on her screen and began translating in real time, which she could now do, because she had not stopped reading for 19 hours, and the language had settled into her the way a language does when you have been inside it long enough. It took 11 minutes for the text to finish. Then Voss had it. She read it twice. She looked up from her console, and the crew nearest her looked at her face and looked away. She called Reyes. She read her the message. Then Reyes called Drath and read it to him too. The message said, the interrupt was not a failsafe. It was the point. The harvest was never the goal. The architects had gone looking for a species that could make the choice they had lost the ability to make, and they had built the harvest as the pressure that would force the question. Everything, the Vakthari seeding, the cycles, the taking of species, was a search, conducted across 500 million years for someone who would say both. The mothership was an archive of everyone who had said anything else. Thousands of species, preserved, not dead, held in a state without a translation into 3-dimensional language. The message said, now that the question has been answered, the archive can open. And then the last part. The architects themselves were inside, not separate, preserved alongside everyone they had taken, because they could not free anyone until someone gave the answer that would free them too. They had built a trap for themselves and waited inside it for 500 million years. Voss filed that away to think about later. On the Vakthari fleet, the news moved fast. Within 2 hours, every crew member knew that their civilization was not what they had believed, that the drive pushing them outward for 2,000 years was not their own, that they had been a tool in someone else's design. Drath expected rage. He got something quieter, a long, collective stillness. He watched his crew stand at their stations and look at nothing and process it, and he thought this was what it looked like when a people had to decide in real time what they were if they were not what they had always thought. He called Reyes. He said, I want to meet in person, no weapons, just talking. She said, same. They met at a neutral cargo platform 3 days later. Reyes, Doran, Voss, and Drath with 2 of his officers. The platform was cold and poorly lit and smelled of metal. Nobody had arranged it to be comfortable. Nobody needed to. Drath studied Doran for a long moment. Then he said, my people have a tradition. When a warrior earns something that cannot be repaid, we say their name into the record, not for honor, for truth. He said Doran's name in Vakthari, 7 syllables, a rising tone at the end. Doran said he did not know what to do with that. Drath said, neither do I, we will learn. The mothership began its opening sequence 4 days later. The archive held patterns of mind and memory from thousands of species preserved across geological time, and releasing them was not fast. Voss observed and documented and understood about 8% of what she saw. She filed the rest under future work. The war did not simply end. Wars do not end because the shooting stops. There were negotiations and demands and failures and arguments and slow repairs. The Vakthari Dominion fractured at three internal fault lines. Earth rebuilt slowly. Nobody got what they wanted. But both sides stayed at the table. That was the new thing. The thing that had not existed before and now did. The knowledge, tested and proven under the worst possible pressure, that staying was something both sides were capable of. Voss stayed aboard the mothership for 3 months. She read. She documented. She sent reports that took months to reach anyone and longer to be understood. One evening she sat in the archive bay with the lights low and the records of 1,000 civilizations surrounding her, dead and not dead at the same time, and thought about the 31st symbol, the river branching one, the one that had almost slipped, the one Doran's hand had held steady at the last moment. She was glad it had not slipped. Outside the viewport, a Vakthari cruiser and a human frigate were running parallel courses, 300 meters apart, close enough to see each other's running lights. Not allies yet, not anything with a clean name, but present, both of them, in the dark. Still there,